grew up in northwest London, and you've written about it before, and now you've come back to NW. What is this thing about this neighborhood that you feel so strongly about?
I think, certainly when you walk into it, there's nothing probably on the surface that strikes you as particularly beautiful. But maybe what's unusual about it, and maybe that Danish people can relate to, as they say in America, is that I grew up effectively in a village. It might not look like a village, but it is very village-like. It was built as a kind of contemporary urban suburb. So what would happen was you'd build a tube stop, and then the village would kind of follow it. And my part was at 1899, and the whole of that suburb was built in 1899 very quickly. And it kind of stretched out along the Jubilee and Metropolitan lines this way. So it's a village of people who aren't really aware of their border-like context, I think I put a line in the book about the map of London, because when I was growing up, I really thought that I lived in the centre of London, and Oxford Street was somewhere in the suburbs that you went to, for Christmas presents. That was all I thought that street was for. So it's interested me, that kind of realignment in your head of a city, where your part is central and important, and what's meant to be central is really kind of far off on the borders for you. And then maybe it's just a matter of being in a place for long enough. The thing which is quite beautiful about that suburb is its layers. So if you don't look properly, it just seems to you like a grubby bit of 21st century London. But if you look up, the buildings are from the 1890s and onwards. The train stations are from the 20s and 30s. The churches are sometimes medieval, going back. There's a church from the 1100s in my neighbourhood. So there are these layers of English life there, despite all our attempts to tear it down and reconstruct it. They continue. And it's my best chance of knowing somewhere fully. Now, I think that is true of writers, that, particularly English writers, that they're obsessively local. Got Hardy on one side, or Nick Hornby, people who have stuck to one corner one way or another.
But it's also a part of London which, as you said, was laid out, but to be perhaps something else than it became.
Yes, it's interesting. I think it was meant to be originally kind of almost like country living, no? Like 50 years before, in like the mid-1800s, you would have taken sheep and literally walked them up Kilburn High Road till you got to Bond Street. I mean, it's that recent, really. And I know when you're in it now, it can seem like there's a radical break between that England and this England. There's a kind of conservative mindset which makes you want to think that the change is genuinely radical and unretrievable, and this is a new England entirely. But everywhere I look, I see links. Sometimes very simple ones, like in the language. There is a thing that black teenagers say in England. They say, if you say, "Will you meet me here?" They say, "I don't know, it's a long traipse. I got traipse from here to there. I don't want to traipse all that way." But that word is, in fact, a very old English word. You can find it in the Doomsday Book. It's that kind of continuity that maybe the people using the language aren't even aware of. Or when a young black boy says, "What have you been doing?" and his friend says, "I'm nothing, I'm on my Jack Jones." It's another very old piece of English rhyming slang. I'm on my Jack Jones on my own. So it's that kind of thing which interests me, that the break isn't as radical as perhaps it looks.
Would I be wrong if I thought when I ended reading NW that it's like a novel about novels?
Maybe that's true of all my novels, one way or another. I kind of a kind of person who's been built out of books. I guess I do come to a book with a very precise plan, and with this one I was thinking not so much of novels really, but of philosophers. I was trying to think what there's a lot of 20th century novels which you would call existential novels one way or another, where people feel quite discontinuous with themselves, or feel out of context, or feel they have to invent their lives day by day. A lot of French novels, obviously, in that department. But there aren't a lot of, I guess, what I want to call black existentialist novels. There's always an idea that people of colour are very sure about their identity because they've had to be, because there are these arguments that we've had to put forward for our civil rights or to move forward. But it might also be the case that people of colour feel the same feelings that everybody in the 20th century feels, no? Disconnection, isolation, loneliness, boredom. Boredom is a big one. So I wanted to try and write about those feelings too, but with a different cast. Yeah.
I'm trying to find out whether she's a likable person. She's a sweet person in the way that she is so insecure about what to do and how to do. But there's one thing she's extremely sure about, and that is that she does not want to have a child.
Yeah, I mean, what interested me while I was writing this, I was having children, and you get dragged in one way or another into the kind of culture wars around children. And I began to notice something I don't remember from my childhood, and I don't remember certainly from my mother's generation, of a real war about this issue. If it ever comes up in an article on the internet, it'll get 700 comments of people screaming at each other about whether or not they have children or should have children or want to have children or not going to have children. And it interested me that it becomes such a contested area. Like, why was it become such a violent matter? Something which had always been a private thing one way or another. And that interested me. And it seemed to me part of it was this sense that people had that they should intimately and profoundly desire something. And of course, when we talk to our mothers, if you ask them, did you intimately and profoundly desire children? They just say, no, I just had a child, I was 20. That's what everybody did. So the idea of waiting for this thing that doesn't appear, and then when it doesn't appear, thinking that somehow you're unusual or unnatural, but in fact you're asking for something which never existed before. This massive passion, this will. Obviously some people have always had, but there was a different social arrangement then. So things happen in an almost automatic way. So that interested me. And then I'm always a keen reader. I worked very briefly when I was young on Just 17, which was a teen magazine in England. I won a competition to work on it when I was about 15. It stopped me for the rest of my life reading ladies' magazines, but there's a section in that magazine there used to be which was about the personal life, letters or personal stories. And I was under the impression when I was a kid reading it that they were genuine personal stories. But of course, anyone who works in a magazine knows it's nonsense.
Like the horoscopes.
Yeah, complete nonsense. And the editorial team gets together and thinks, well, what is a good story for today that will engage the various lady readers of the magazine? And I saw in a story while I was writing this book in Grazia, which I'm sure is here too, it's in England and America and all over. The big personal story was about a girl who's married, 5-6 years and has everything and is perfectly happy, but she's secretly taking the pill to stop being pregnant and hasn't told her husband. And what interests me about it is that the editorial team knew, I read it with great interest, and that they had a great instinct for understanding that 1 million women in England would open this story and really want to read it. And really wanting to read it, that interested me too. Why is that story interesting now? Why would anybody want to read such a peculiar tale of a woman who's pretending she wants to have children but actually not having children? And the more I talked to female friends of mine, I found, I think, a very common experience in my generation of women who, at one and the same time, absolutely want children, absolutely don't want them. In the same breath, in the same moment, and they're just completely sincere. It's the same feeling, split in two. And so I just thought that was an interesting thing, really. I wanted to try and document it. When I'm writing, I'm always trying to find some echo of the times that I'm in. And that seemed to be a peculiar thing about the times that we're in. This kind of schizophrenia on what used to be an easier issue.
But one thing is that she doesn't want to have children. Another thing is that she has a very sweet husband who not only washes her hair but also makes love to her and is in general a good-looking, nice man, doesn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And she cheats on him. I mean, not by going out with other men, but by taking a pill. And he has a great desire to have children. For him, it's like his fate, his idea of what is the future. The future is that I'm going to have children.
Well, this is something else that I noticed. Like, the culture is very, the popular culture is always a little behind and always cliched and always has an agenda. So if you understood the popular culture, you would believe that women are running around the world, desperately trying to have children, pinning young men down. It's not true. It's the opposite is true. Women are running 1 million miles in the opposite direction, trying to work. And in fact, when you meet men, you meet a lot of very sentimental young men who want to have children, who want a wife, a proper wife who does things for him. And so part of, a proper wife. Yeah, that's what they want. So I think partly when you're writing, part of the job is always looking at the common sense or the received wisdom and asking yourself, well, is it really true? And I don't think it is really true. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And when you talk to people about their marriages, it would be much easier if, as it is in the soap operas and the teledramas, everybody was being cheated on by wicked men with long moustaches. But that's not accurate. That's not what's happening to people's marriages. Other things are happening. Boredom and contempt and just a tedium that goes over everything. It's not that way, that one person is always to blame. No, it's a little more complicated than that.
If we move over to another female character in W, she's the friend of Leah, Keisha, who becomes Natalie because she changes her name, and also gets quite a nice husband, a wealthy one who takes her up to a different social level. And she's the opposite of Leah because she really knows what she wants. She wants to become a lawyer and takes. It's not easy, but she does it, and ends up cheating on her husband as well.
Yeah, the bad girls, these girls.
Yes, nasty girls.
Well, that's also a kind of tyranny of novels, that women are always very sympathetic in them, generally, no?
Most readers are
That's
women.
true. Most readers are women, and I think most women, just as I do, want to feel good about themselves most of the time, no? And there's a whole genre of novel which is there to make you feel what a wonderful, empathetic, lovely lady you are. And I also like feeling that way, but I don't think it's accurate all the time, That's the problem. So I just wanted to try and write something about people who... It's kind of the opposite of that Jane Austen instinct. I love Austen, and I love the idea that women and people in general are kind of rational operators who are always trying to reach the good and do good and bring good into their lives. But looking at the evidence of human existence, that isn't the overriding feeling. People also try and bring darkness into their own lives and screw up their lives and create perversity everywhere. So trying to cover that as well is important. But, different books have different moods. When I was writing on beauty, I really wanted to write about joy, about the experience of joy. But when I was writing this, I wanted to write about midlife and how things become complicated,
Because they do.
Yeah, they do.
But perhaps we could also talk about then the way that you describe Natalie is completely different from the way you describe Leah.
Yeah.
I know that the chapter on Leah has been placed as joyesque, as Ulysses-like, because it's kind of stream of consciousness. And I know you've said, I did not think of Ulysses for one moment while I was writing this.
You'd be an insane writer to sit down and think of Ulysses.
Yes, I'm just
I don't do that
Can
very
I
often.
copy this from... No, I can understand that. But how did, in writing this, how do you change from one mood to another?
It was interesting. The one reason for me for writing the book was to do that. So it's hard to describe, I think, sometimes to readers the impetus behind writing novels. Like, it's not really accurate to say you write on beauty because you're really interested in what happens to Howard Belsey. I know what happens to Howard Belsey. That's of no interest to me. That's something which is a kind of seconds work. So for me, writing the book is about, in that case and on beauty's case, and getting a certain kind of colour to it, a certain tone. And in that case, it was the tone of, I suppose, the kind of 19th century novels that I've loved, that kind of all-seeing author. The question is, can I do that? That's always my question to myself. And in this book, I thought, can I write a book of 4 completely different modes, but with a story that's interlinked? So that's what interests me as I sit down. And it's much more fun. It was a difficult book to write, but it was nice to know at the end of Leah's section, well, now I'm going to go to Felix's section, which is a kind of, third-person piece of kind of classic storytelling. And then I'm going to do this strange thing with Natalie, where it's written in numbered sections. And when you're writing for 7 years, it's nice to know that you're going to leave one room and enter another, instead of just being stuck in the same room all day long.
But if we turn to Felix, who's a very sweet boy. Actually, all the men, almost all the men.
Yeah, the men are nice. That's terrible.
They're really nice. And of all the nice men, I would say
nice.
Felix is perhaps the nicest, even though he hasn't been given the easiest cards to play from his background. Will you tell
Yeah,
us a
Felix
little
is
about
very nice.
Felix?
He was based quite directly on. There's a Flaubert story called A Simple Heart, which is about a nice girl called Felicia who then dies, basically. And the thing about Flaubert, which is so striking, is that he can take very fantastically ordinary people. No, I mean, Madame Bovary is so ordinary; she's almost banal. All she does is cheat. She's just there's nothing interesting about her as a person, and yet you're so engaged and so obsessed with what's to happen to her. But if I told you the story of Madame Bovary, it's a piece of gossip, which one housewife tells to another. It lasts about 35 seconds. So with Flaubert, I think for him also it's a kind of dare, like what can I do with this material which couldn't be more suburban, which couldn't be more banal, and he worked this wonder out of it. So that's something I always love. Like when people ask me what my books are about, I sometimes take a lot of pleasure in explaining what they're about, which is basically nothing. Nothing happens in these books. Nobody does anything. It's just some people. They're just alive. They have friends. They get married. There's nothing's going to happen of any great consequence. So with Felix, I just wanted to see if I could make somebody and then, I guess, kill them and have you care about it. It's quite a difficult thing to do. It's not a real person. It's just 30 pages. So you really have to put some work in to make anybody feel that someone's been lost.
You feel it. You did it.
I
was really sorry to see him go.
I was really sorry, and it was really one of my favourite bits of the book to write, because it was really there isn't a lot that's interesting about Felix really, but he's so generous, he's so kind. He hasn't got any of the usual novelistic values which are more exciting. That you have to be dramatic or clever or witty. Or Felix isn't really any of those things. He's just a good guy, and it's hard to write good guys. Good writes white, as they say in England sometimes. Yeah.
I thought a lot about what made me so sad about losing Felix, and I think it's because the way you write it, he has his hopes up high.
Yeah, he's really ambitious.
He's like signing off a period of his life, and he has found the girl he wants to be with, who makes him feel that life is worth living, and he handles a difficult father, and he says goodbye to a difficult mistress or girlfriend, or what we should call her. And then he does a beautiful thing for a pregnant woman in the subway or the tube.
Yeah.
And gets killed for it.
Well, I thought also, while I was writing this book, there was an epidemic of stabbings, basically, in London, usually of young black boys, by young black boys. And when you read the headlines, which are usually not very big, you can get the idea that it's just a youth who was killed by another youth, and it's not really your problem because you live in another part of town. But in my case, my brothers are young black men, and there's so many in my family, my friends. So every time you open the paper, your heart is in your throat. And also the person who's been killed is not a youth, it's a human being with a history, with family, with sisters, brothers, friends. So just trying to make that person live in somebody's imagination. I really wanted to try and do that because England is a small country, but a lot of the variety in it is kind of condensed, I guess, in London and some of the other big cities, Bradford, Manchester, Birmingham, etc. But there are a lot of people in the country who live in still quite homogenous communities who it's just a black boy who got killed in the street. It just doesn't compute to them as something that's really happening, or a crime, or that a human being is dead. It's just a social incident. So trying to animate that person, give them a backstory, give them a life, make them a human being, but also not save them absurdly, because the boys who do get stabbed in England are often in the middle of their lives. They're just beginning, something's about to happen. They're doing their A-levels, they're just moving on to the next stage, and they're cut down, and it is a tragedy.
There was a reason to be sad, even a larger reason than in the novel, perhaps. But also in the book, time is different. I mean, you move with time. You say that when you start out, you know what you're going to write, more or less. But what is time for you in a novel?
Well, I think it's everything. It's the kind of morality of the thing, and it's the style of the thing. the way that a writer thinks about time and the time of their lives is kind of what novel writing is, more or less, how you pass action and behavior across time. So, maybe the novels we're most familiar with or fond of, that kind of 19th century form, believe that time parcels out in equal measure through each stage of your life and kind of moves towards an ending, an ending which is filled with meaning and makes sense. And my experience of being alive is that it begins that way and then it starts to speed up intolerably, particularly in your kind of mid-30s. These summers, as everyone knows, which seemed endless, I'm sure, particularly Danish summers when you're 9 years old by the water, start to flick by in an eyelid. You don't even have time to see your friends in 1 year. You see them twice. And you start speeding towards the grave. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You're just racing in that direction. And I hear that it gets worse and worse. But I remember when I went to see my father, he had not long to live, and I did that thing. I wrote about it at one point of trying to record him to tell me, I don't know what I thought he was going to tell me. But one of the things he did say, when I said, well, how does it feel to be 83? And he said, well, I don't know, I blinked. I was 16 and I blinked. And that is a really dark thought. But I think particularly when you're in your teens and your 20s, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like this infinite stretch. So I wanted to try and record that experience, that thing about time, where it feels like it's speeding up. And also that feeling, for whatever reason, it's best left to the sociologists, that my generation have of perpetual adolescence, of not being willing to move on or ready to move on, or being surprised when time has moved on. That's something I also wanted to put in a novel, because I have so many friends who are literally in shock that they're about to be 40.
I see them frozen in time.
Yeah, they cannot get over that this is going to happen. So that's interesting too, that what has been, I don't say it's natural or unnatural, because nature changes when society changes, but it's certainly the case that we had a situation where we had childhood, then recently invented adolescence, then you would have your children reasonably early, a period of childcare, then grandparents, and then maybe your parents die later, and things were parceled out in a certain way. Now it happens that you are young till you're 38, you have children, your parents die on the same day, and then if you're lucky, you get another 10, 15 years. Life feels very cramped, the major part of life, into a small area. And I'm sure that fiction will catch up with that change, The novels will look different, they'll be shaped differently, because life is shaped differently.
But also time is the age of the persons that you describe. You have to move in the character's time, don't you? Yeah,
I think people experience time differently. I tried to make a case in this book that women experience it differently than men in various ways, partly because of this biological time, which no matter what happens on the kind of phenotype of society, no matter how much you change laws or change circumstance, we have a different biology. It moves in a different way, and that's the bottom line. It's just the bottom line. It doesn't mean that things need to be set up in an inferior way for women, but that biological timepiece within us is real, and that is different than it is for men. It also seems to me that for women, the existence of a thing called the menopause, which is like an enormous lighted sign saying, things are ending, never happens to men, which I think is a great advantage for women and a disaster for men, because they don't notice. And they're 65 and their girl is 22, and it's all a shock to them. It's good to have some mourning, I think. Yeah.
When you write about Northwest London, it's of course it's a very specific place for you, but it also becomes a character in itself in this book. It's a lot of streets and street names and signs and boutiques and things, shops to look at and so on. And sometimes while I was reading it, it was almost like it was a three-dimensional novel.
Yeah, there's a lot local in it. You can make a decision. There is a kind of writing that goes on now, which it's not for me, because we're aware that novels are published globally and are translated globally, there is a way you can kind of flatten out the prose first of all, so it's comprehensible everywhere in every zone. You can do that, and you can also kind of flatten out place. No, so your basic international, global reader, traveller person can recognise, the basic cities. There's Paris, there's New York. They get an idea, like those late Woody Allen movies. Here's the Eiffel Tower. Have you seen the Bilbao? That kind of thing. But basically, I like things which are really genuinely local, and I think you have to have a little faith that a reader will come to that locality and try to have it in their brain and try to comprehend it. In that case, Joyce is a great example, because nothing could be more precise or obsessive than his Dublin, but people all over the world have taken that Dublin into their hearts and their minds. And
it almost sounds like doubling.
Yeah.
Doubling.
Yeah. That's you need that kind of precision, I think. That's what I look for in fiction anyway. I don't want this kind of blank international novel. I'm not concerned with that.
Thank you so much for
coming.
Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.